There's almost like two different kinds of happiness. There's that hedonic form of happiness where we're basically equating happiness with feeling good. And then there's this other form of happiness where happiness is not so much about feeling good, but about doing things that we find really meaningful or doing hard things. Like, why climb a mountain? Why write a book? I've often had the thought, writing books is the most psychotic thing anyone could do. It's just, you're putting yourself out there. It's so vulnerable. People trash you on Goodreads and Amazon and whatever. Why do this? And I think that the answer to that is that there's something, maybe it doesn't feel good in the moment, but there's something really beautiful about directly experiencing these really challenging emotions or really challenging situations or really challenging projects and approaching them instead of turning away the moment things get tricky and the moment things get hard. So to me, that's really like some of the most beautiful moments I've ever had in my life are those moments that maybe didn't feel so good, but they were so meaningful and so beautiful to me. And I think of all art or creativity like this. It's a torturous experience, but it's also the creation of something beautiful.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New Age Sage podcast. My guest today is Nate Klemp. He is a New York Times bestselling author, philosopher, and mindfulness entrepreneur, and recent author of Open, a book that was truly amazing. And I just want to thank you for coming. And I want to start with the concept of being open. Like, first off, what does being open to life really mean? And why is it the greatest life hack ever?
Well, first of all, Lucas, thank you for having me. I'm a big fan of your work, so it's really fun to be here with you having this conversation. Why is it the greatest life hack ever? Which, by the way, I love that branding. I might take that.
It really is, in my experience. So.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's the greatest, but also the deepest and maybe most difficult life hack.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
The way I think about it is in relation to its opposite, which is closed. And I actually think most of us have a lot more familiarity with that closed state of mind, especially these days, where for many of us, there's this experience of, it's almost like there's less space in the mind. And that's driven by a couple things. One is, many of us have this craving or addiction for our screens that allows us to basically short circuit difficult emotions, discomfort, things like that. But the other piece of it is we tend to be more and more closed increasingly to each other, to people who disagree with us, people who vote for the other candidate. So I like to think of the cultural center of gravity right now being one of closure, one of compression. And in that sense, the idea of cultivating a more open mind feels like this incredibly countercultural act.
Yes.
We're essentially resisting these forces of gravity that are pulling us toward closure. And I think, why is it important? Well, if I had to distill it down to one thing, it's this idea that when the mind opens, we get more space there. The mind becomes more expansive. And a lot of people say, well, who cares about getting more space in your mind? That's not a very big deal. But I actually think it's a huge deal because that's the space that allows us to respond instead of react in a triggered way. It's the space between stimulus and response that allows us to create new and better habits. Ultimately, I think this is the space of possibility, the space of creativity, the space of freedom. So it's a huge deal, even though it may not sound like a very big deal, to have a little more space in the mind.
In what you're saying, I think there has to be an awareness in the individual that they are closed, which most have no idea about. So I try and think of the listener. Most people are just like, they don't know what we're talking about. So in this instance, what does it mean when someone is closed? How can you be aware of yourself and feel like I am being closed to life right now? What does that look like?
I love what you're pointing out there, because part of the predicament is that when we're closed down, it often is accompanied by a state of unawareness or unconsciousness. Yeah. So that becomes a really difficult problem to solve. It's kind of like in the modern psychology, the modern lexicon of psychology, they talk about this idea of mind wandering, which I think is a key aspect of closure. It's that state we're in where our mind is kind of traveling through time, through all sorts of stories about the past and the future. And importantly, we don't even know that it's happening. So to your point, I think the first thing we need to consider is how can we become more aware of these moments of closure as they're happening in real time? And that's a really tricky thing to do. I mean, one way we can think about doing that is by having a practice like meditation, which I think of as almost like the basic strengthening and conditioning program that we can use to cultivate more awareness. The other thing we can do is just start to repurpose some of these idle moments of our life. I like to think that we have hundreds of these throwaway moments every day where you're waiting for a Uber to come, or you're waiting for your inbox to refresh, or you're dropping your kid off from school. And in these idle moments, we tend to distract ourselves. We tend to reach out for our phone. But if we can use just a few of those idle moments, maybe 25% of them, as opportunities to take this step back, have that moment of awareness. Hey, what's actually happening in my mind right now? What's the urge that's driving my habitual behavior? And what if I were to just open up to a more expansive view of this moment, even if this moment is the line at Costco,
Yeah.
With kids screaming and people yelling at you or whatever it is, right? We're in all these messy moments, but those are all opportunities, I think, for opening. And that's where we can get into that moment to moment practice that you're talking about of becoming more aware.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest culprit for our societal collective need to shut down, as you mentioned a lot in the book and what you previously said, is technology is having this weapon of mass distraction in our pockets at all times. And to be fully honest with you and the listeners, I've conquered many things in my life. I can feel almost all my emotions. I haven't eaten processed foods in years. I work out almost every day. I still haven't figured out my phone. I still have not figured it out. I still get distracted. I still check it when I shouldn't check it. So what's been your prescription for yourself to feel like you have power over your phone? Because I honestly haven't gotten there myself, and it really frustrates me. I can get hard on myself about it, and I think almost everyone struggles with it. So it's not just a unique experience. So what has been like your method to not feel like you are owned by technology and it doesn't let you just stay closed all the time?
First of all, I love your own admission that you've conquered all of these things. I mean, I know a little bit about your story and your journey with addiction and, conquered physical fitness and nutrition, and you're still hooked on this. My story is the same. I've spent the last...
It's been the hardest one. It's as hard as drugs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think part of it, because I have the exact same experience, I've been meditating, doing yoga really intensely for 15 years or so, and I can't seem to shake this. And I think part of the predicament we're in here is that, unlike an addiction to substances, where you can actually say, I'm never going to touch this substance again. I mean, I suppose you can do that with your phone. It's just a really radical lifestyle choice.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to end up living at a pond like Thoreau at Walden,
Mm-hmm.
isolated from society. You're not going to be able to do podcasts and post on social media and all that stuff. So for those of us who want to stay in society and stay connected, it's really tricky because we're using these technologies that are designed carefully to basically extract every last ounce of our attention and manipulate our psychology, but we still have to use them gauge. So to me, that's the predicament. And one way that I went about exploring this in the book is I wanted to see what happens when we try overindulgence as a strategy. And the reason I was led to this is I had tried all of these screen restriction techniques, screen time management techniques, and I noticed that in some ways those built the experience of craving. They almost like fueled craving for me. So I got really curious, like what would happen if I just overindulged? So I spent like 3 days just binging on screens and on political outrage. And it was really interesting because one of the things I experienced at the end of that was that I realized the primary thing bringing me back to my device again and again is this experience of novelty, something new, something unexpected.
Yep.
And by overindulging, I was able to have this feeling that I had seen everything there was to see. And in a way, I felt like I had destroyed the superpower of my phone, this experience of novelty. So all that's to say, like, I think we can go about this in a lot of different ways. There's overindulgence, which is a way of like overshooting our habitual patterns with our phones. And then there's underindulgence, things like dopamine fasting, things like self-binding techniques. In my house, we have a K-safe where we lock our
I have the same
devices.
thing.
I don't know if you've heard of that, but
No, I use it. I use it all the time.
yeah, I think we can use both. We can underindulge, we can overindulge. And the key is that we're just breaking out of our ordinary sort of set of habits and trying something new and getting a different perspective and a little more awareness.
So those are the systems you have now? You have the K-safe. Is there anything else you do to kind of conquer that phone, social media? How do you manage your social media?
Yeah, well, so there's one other hack here that's one of my go-tos, one of my favorites. I call it dopamine dessert. And it comes from this idea in habit formation research that one of the best ways we can create new and better habits is by designing environments such that there's more friction between us and the problematic habit, less friction between us and the good habit. And we can do that in the physical space. So things like kicking your phone out of your bedroom, K-safe, et cetera, et cetera. But I think we can also do it in the temporal space or the space of time. So this idea of dopamine dessert is I reserve on my calendar every day a half hour or so, sometimes more, where I allow myself to just like totally indulge in all of my favorite distractions. That's when I read the news. That's when I like look at random videos on Instagram, things like that. And what's really cool about time boxing it like that is that then when I'm earlier in the day trying to focus on work or whatever,
Yeah.
and I have the thought, oh, now I want to look at the news or I want to check this thing, I can think to myself, no, I've got dopamine dessert coming up. And it's kind of interesting because it actually becomes like this weird digital treat. I mean, it is kind of like real dessert. When you don't eat sugar all day and then you have a nice dessert, it tastes so good, right? Because you haven't had sugar all day.
Yeah.
And I think we can do the same thing with dopamine and digital hits of pleasure.
Yeah.
We can concentrate it, look forward to it, and sort of isolate it from the rest of our day. And maybe you have 2 dopamine desserts, maybe you have 3, I don't know. But the goal is to not have continuous hits of dopamine from the moment you wake up to the moment you go to sleep.
Yeah, I do the same thing. I call it fasting because I eat one meal a day normally. Like my food, I fast 23 hours a day.
Wow.
So I did the same for social media. I was like, it should be the same kind of advantage.
Totally.
But I did it well for like a month, but I've been fucking up recently. So how do you keep yourself disciplined enough to not break the hour window? Because I was doing well at it, and now I'm just going back to square one. So how have you kept yourself disciplined when it came to the dopamine dessert hour, half an hour?
I wish I had a magic bullet here for you, Lucas, but I feel like I have the same problem where I'll be really good with all this. And then what will happen for me is I'll start to get really stressed about something, really overwhelmed. And that's when I end up overindulging in digital consumption. So for me, the pattern that seems to be happening is I will just start to notice this subtle drift happening where I'm distracting myself more. I'm making all these like exceptions, like, oh, well, this morning I'm going to allow myself to check the news, but just for this morning, right? That kind of like craving brain that starts tricking you. And so when I start to see that happening, then I'll try to just set a stronger intention, come back. And then it seems like it's almost inevitable that there will be that drift, and that's okay. That's almost like a cue to come back.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about it almost like this macro level pattern of you drift, you come back, you drift, you come back. Being perfect all the time, I think is impossible, at least for me.
Yeah. And beyond this, I think I had a guru teach me most of what I know since I've been about 19, 20. And he always told me that the hardest thing for a human to tolerate is ease and boredom. That once you conquer that, life's done. That we have these habitual tendencies to need to stress and to get in arguments. And I always thought, you're crazy, man. Like being bored and is easy. Then I'm realizing now what you're saying, and in my experience, that the reason why we check these phones all the time is we just can't tolerate ease. We can't tolerate no issues, no drama, no nothing. So how's your experience been with that? And what do you think about that? This concept that human beings just cannot tolerate ease and boredom, that we always need stimulation to feel safe. We need threats to feel safe in this weird psychological conundrum.
I think that's so beautiful, the way your guru put it. And it certainly makes sense with my experience anyway, that there is something incredibly unnerving about boredom. And you couple that, which I think has always been there, with our unique ability now as moderns to basically like whip out our phone at any moment and quickly solve the problem of boredom. And I think that puts us in this really interesting predicament where we now almost don't even know what it's like to experience boredom. Like I look at my daughter who's 12 and she's never experienced a world without smartphones. And luckily
Yeah.
she's not on social media yet. But what I notice in her and her generation is that there's almost not even an understanding of what boredom is. I think back to being in high school in the 90s for me, and all of these moments of just sitting there, waiting for a bus, sitting with my thoughts. And yeah, it was boring, but there was something really beautiful about that time because it gave me space to just get in touch with what was happening in my mind, to think outside of my ordinary stressful mind stream and come up with maybe new and more creative ideas about how to spend my time, whatever it was. And so this is why I think those self-binding techniques are really interesting, like the K-safe, or there's this new thing called the brick that I just got, where you basically bind yourself so you can't use certain apps on your phone and you have to touch your phone against this brick again. And I think all of those are so cool because they're essentially creating that kind of space where we can be bored again and get more in touch with what that's like. And I love what you're saying too, that maybe there's like a really close connection between boredom and ease. And that once we learn how to be bored, we can be at ease.
I think the most powerful example of it is in romantic relationships. I've noticed that people run away or create problems when they just feel bored, when things are easy, right?
Yeah.
I realize that in my experience, I just would cause arguments or think of things that would cause suffering or dramatic notions. And when I try and look at couples that are doing well as reference points of like, okay, they're doing it right, these are not.
Yeah.
And they're just kind of bored. They just stay at home. They don't do much. They they're not too exciting, but they're happy. They're easy. And I think that's what I've learned in my life too, that when things are good in life, it's hard to last because we just make these constant issues in our mind. But within the concept of being open, I think that obviously we close down when we suffer, when we encounter pain, when we encounter discomfort. Why is it advantageous to open to suffering? And more so, the powerful question is how the fuck do we open to suffering? Right?
Totally.
How can we say yes to feeling the terror stuck in our unconscious minds? Like I truly believe we're all in deep fear of everything at all times, really. So how can we open to these nefarious sensations, and what's the advantage of doing so?
Oh man, I love this question. So much there. I guess the first part of the question is, why should we even do this in the first place? And it's funny, this is a question I ask myself a lot in life. I've ended up on this path of studying philosophy and getting really interested in technologies like mindfulness and this whole idea of opening to all experiences in life. And I still have these moments where I think to myself, wouldn't it be easier if I just spend my time trying to essentially bypass all the difficulties of life and all the suffering of life and just allowed myself to consume these really quick and easy hits of pleasure all day, every day? Like, wouldn't that maybe be an easier life? And I think it might actually be an easier life, but I don't think it would be as interesting. I think that we all know that there's almost like two different kinds of happiness. There's that hedonic form of happiness where we're basically equating happiness with feeling good. And then there's this other form of happiness where happiness is not so much about feeling good, but about doing things that we find really meaningful or doing hard things, like why climb a mountain? Why write a book? I mean, I've often had the thought writing books is the most psychotic thing anyone could do. It's just, you're putting yourself out there. It's so vulnerable. People trash you on Goodreads and Amazon and whatever. Like, why do this? And I think that the answer to that is that there's something, maybe it doesn't feel good in the moment, but there's something really beautiful about directly experiencing these really challenging emotions or really challenging situations or really challenging projects and approaching them instead of turning away the moment things get tricky and the moment things get hard. And so to me, that's really like some of the most beautiful moments I've ever had in my life are those moments that maybe didn't feel so good, but they were so meaningful and so beautiful to me. And I think of all art or creativity like this. It's a torturous experience, but it's also the creation of something beautiful. Um, I don't know. I'd be curious to get your thoughts on that. I'm sure you've been thinking about this question a lot.
Yeah, I think for me it's tricky because I've reached a point in my consciousness and awareness, I don't know if you're similar, where I can't not be open, where
Mm,
I've meditated enough, I've done enough enough potent psychedelics, I've just gone far enough on this journey where I
yeah.
just can't close down. I just can't. Like if any feeling of terror or anger or anxiety comes up, I'm at a point now where I can't avoid it. No matter what I do, it's just there.
Yeah.
I've become at a point in my consciousness where I'm just the awareness most of the time, so I just can't bypass shit. I can't like
Yeah.
not feel certain things. I can not give it much attention or add thoughts to it, but I can't really not notice how I feel. I don't know if are you the same in that sense? Like, are you at a point in your meditative journey where you just can't really bypass the way you feel? Where just are you at that point? You think?
That's a really interesting observation. I think for me, when it comes to those really existential mind states, fear, anxiety, things like that, I would say I experienced something similar where I don't know if the word is I can't, but it's like it just feels like every bone in my body wants to explore this state and see what's there
Yeah,
and wants to see what does it feel like to experience the full range of human emotion, which includes a lot more than just happiness and feeling good. It includes FOMO and it includes anxiety and irritation and rage and all these different things. And for me, I guess I just find it really interesting to experience that full range of emotions. It's kind of like travel. You could stay in your own little hometown for your whole life and that would be fine. But it's kind of interesting to go to different cultures and different countries where people do things differently. And I mean, in some ways, our emotions and our mind is kind of like a world in that sense. There are all these different states and emotions and feelings. And I guess I'm just drawn to experiencing them all and seeing if I can understand them, seeing if I can stay with them.
so what keeps you staying with them is this curiosity. But what do you feel like's on the end of the rainbow? Like what is the outcome for you that you're looking for? Like for me,
Yeah.
for example, the reason why I allow myself to just feel everything is because I do believe in my spiritual practice that if a wounding is still there, hasn't been done teaching me. I do believe that in my experience that and
Mm.
woundings I've cleared in my life, traumas I've cleared is because I've learned a lesson. I've learned why it's there and
Yeah.
how to not let it affect my life. But when a certain trigger keeps happening, I believe in my philosophy that it hasn't been done teaching me. So I just know that the more I go down this route and allow myself to feel it, the more of the pot of gold's there at the end. So what's the motivational factor in you diving into these sensations? Is it just curiosity or is there some kind of outcome you're looking for?
I think of it like this. There are two ways that I often experience my life. One is this path of self mastery and control, where I think to myself, I've got this plan for my life. I'm going to do everything I can to optimize my life and optimize for the achievement of this goal. And what I've found just over and over again in my life is that that's actually not that interesting. That's certainly the momentum of our culture. And you listen to all these podcasts about optimize your diet and your mind and your body and all this stuff and be more productive, whatever. I think it's all good. But the moments that have really changed me were the moments where I was just basically punched in the face by life, or I experienced something so overwhelming that I had no choice but to let go of my plan and just see what was going to happen, see where life was going to lead me. I guess you could call that letting go or something like that. But the the basic idea there is that I just think for me that the gold at the pot of the rainbow is this idea of seeing what life's plan is for me rather than imposing my own plan. Because I found that life's plan is so much more interesting than my plan, like 100 times more interesting. My plan was to be a tenured professor in political philosophy. And I was pretty far down that track. I was 4 years into my professorship, but then life just had this plan that blew it all up. And now I'm doing this totally different thing, writing about totally different stuff that I wouldn't even be allowed to write about as an academic.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, things like that just give me trust that there's this way more interesting plan out there that I don't fully understand, that if I surrender into it will be much more interesting than trying to just boss around life and control everything.
That's probably the greatest place one's mind could be at, is to understand that there is no my way. That the relative scope of control you have over life is like just, you can't even describe how small it is.
Yeah.
And someone for suffering is trying to impose our willpower on the happenings of the universe. So branching off that, in your experience, what are the core moves or inner workings someone could do, or you did, to get to a point where you can trust, call it life, call it God, call it the universe, their way rather than your way? Because I think it's honestly the reason why I mostly suffer is when I find myself in moments of mass suffering. Recently, it's like, this post didn't do well, this podcast didn't do well, these girls aren't, there are all these things that our mind creates that if you go deep down enough, you realize these things are completely out of my control fully. So what in you did you do to get to a place where you could truly surrender to life, God, universe, versus always need things to go your way?
I would say that this is a ongoing practice for me. So I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I live in this state all the time, because I don't.
I definitely don't.
Sometimes I feel like I'm in it. Sometimes I'm not. It's like, and I think very few beings that I've encountered actually hang out here all the time. I feel like I've encountered a few in my time, but very few. But I feel
I've
like
encountered one.
Yeah, I think for me, maybe one or two in my whole life. And that's about it. So I think that it's a paradox in the sense that to control this experience of surrender and letting go is to, in some ways, undermine the very practice itself, right? Because the practice is to let go of control. So if we're trying to control it, we're already outside of the practice. So that, I think, is really interesting and makes it really tricky, because practices like meditation, I think, are really powerful, but they're not necessarily the practice of letting go. It's like if you meditate enough and you are disciplined with it, I almost think of it like you're planting seeds of letting go in the ground, and those seeds are going to grow, but they're not going to grow on your timeline. They're going to grow when they grow. So there's almost this practice of like cultivating the ground through things like meditation or yoga, or just not checking your phone so often, being a little bit more present, things like that. Consciously relaxing your mind and your nervous system. That's all, I think, cultivating the ground such that we can then experience more of these moments that happen in their own organic way, in their own organic timeline. But that, to me, is the real paradox. When I see somebody on Instagram being like, to let go, do these 5 things. And I'm like, well, maybe, but that's not the way it works for me. It's a much more like, it's almost like playing jazz or something, that all I can do is make sure that I'm in the chord progressions and that I'm in the right rhythm. And then there will be these moments that come up organically if I'm disciplined enough with my practice and I just show up enough.
Yeah, I agree. What are those practices? Like, how can... That's, I think, the question I wanted to ask you. What are the practices someone could do to get to a place where they're more likely to be at a place of surrender?
Right. Well, we've talked a little bit about meditation. I think it's worth talking about practices like yoga, or practices where we're relaxing the mind and the body. My experience is that one of the biggest barriers to any form of letting go or opening is contraction. Contraction in the body, contraction in the mind, contraction in the nervous system. And I think we all know this to be true. If you think about you get to the end of a long day at work where you've been in meetings all day, you're on your phone all day. There's this momentum that's generated in your mind and nervous system that is about the opposite of the kind of momentum you want for this experience of letting go, right? It's everything is fast, everything is tight, everything is contracted. So there is this practice, and there are all sorts of amazing lineages of yoga that are teaching this practice, amazing breath techniques, where the whole idea is that we're using breath or postures in meditation to essentially slow all of that down, open up the body, create space in the mind where it's actually possible to do this. And where I think there's an interesting connection, for me at least, between meditation and yoga. Meditation to me is a slightly different practice where you're kind of just seeing things as they are, watching the mind as it is. And sometimes my mind is so amped by the conditions of modern life, it's really hard to let go into that space of meditation. And so a practice like yoga, I think, is a nice complement because it's intentionally about changing that underlying biology such that we actually can let go. We actually
Yeah.
can engage in something like surrender. Does that fit with your experience?
Yeah, no, I think exactly fits in my experience.
Yeah.
And it's a good point because I think most people get hard on themselves and say, oh, why can't my mind just snap into presence and peace
Yeah.
at the end of a hard day? And I used to be that person. I used to be like, I can, willpower this thing and just like make my mind tap into peace and love. But as you're saying, it's almost impossible. Your state precedes your story. So it's like if your physiological state is what creates your mental chatter. So I completely agree. I have a whole routine I do. I need to stretch out, roll out, breathe. I have a whole thing I do to make sure my body relaxes enough so I can relax. Because it's true. If we're in that, you can call it like I call it like dopamine or stressed out Lucas. If you stay in that and you keep feeding your appetite that way, it's like a hungry hippo. It's gonna keep chomping, and you have to calm down enough to relax and ease yourself into relaxation. Because I've been sitting with this recently, what's the efficacy and advantage of creating that duality in the sense of we're on the modern world, in this capitalistic world, we have to work hard, be stressed out. What's the advantage of having that split when you have time? Like 6 p.m. hits, or a day hits, you have free time. What's the advantage of having that split of moving into just complete relaxation?
Yeah.
You get what I'm saying? Like, what has been the advantage for you in having that like split off time of saying, you know what, my phone's away, I'm stretching out, I'm recovering. How has that been different for you versus just going at it all day?
I think of it almost like a light switch. There's on and off. And most of us live most of the time actually in between on and off. When we're at work, we're kind of at work, but we're also looking at Instagram or Facebook or TikTok or email. So we're kind of on, we're kind of off. And then you get home and quote unquote relax. And the habitual mode of relaxation, at least for me, is to like fire up Netflix or, relax by just like scrolling the news on my phone. And we all know that that's not real relaxation. So we're at work and we're in that in-between space, not totally on, not totally off. We're relaxing, we're in that in-between space, not totally on, not totally off. And I think what we lose through that habitual experience of life is the ability to experience what it's like to be fully on in our work. And then likewise to experience what it's like to have those really deep moments of relaxation. And so we're kind of just like opening up the vocabulary of life by having that divide, in my experience, where we can really sit with like deep levels of relaxation, which allow us then when we go back to our work to come back to our work with so much more energy, so many more interesting ideas. And I find even, I don't know if you have this experience too, that when I get into a really hardcore work mode, like I'm just coming off a book launch where I've been just like crazy, doing a million things. And I had the experience the other day where I actually took the time to do some yoga and like just totally chilled in Shavasana for like 25 minutes or something. And it was like I had forgotten what it was to experience relaxation.
Yeah.
And that made me think, for a lot of people, I don't know if they have a reference point at all of what it feels like to experience a really deep state of relaxation. So to me, it's essential to make sure we're alternating between those two, that we're sometimes on, sometimes off, and not just in between all the time.
Yeah, just so you know, that happens to me all the time.
Yeah.
All the time. I'll get a massage or stretch out or something, or hit a certain point of flow in meditation where I'm like, holy shit, I haven't felt this relaxed in like a week.
Well, do you have the experience
It's
where you're
gonna,
like, it's like I didn't even remember what it felt like? It's that alien to me.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, which is sad because it's kind of the state we should be in.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to shift to is we talked a lot about kind of a somatic way of being open. But what I really respect probably the most about the book is the choice to make it about ideological openness too.
Right.
It's a ballsy move that most people would have avoided, right? Because it's like a taboo topic.
Yeah.
But I honestly think it's a most prevalent issue I think we face now in modern America. I truly do.
Yeah.
And I get a lot of backlash sometimes for talking about it, but I don't care because it really is. I've experienced in my own family, like the cost of different political views is costing love and relationships, and lost many friends. And it's just not something I think is needed, right? I think there's a way of, because right now we're operating in a way of like, if you're on this side, I'm on this side, I can't even associate with you. It's done, right? But that seems to be the only way of thinking about it. But in my experience, that's the worst way to go about it. There is a way of staying open to each other, which is what I really, really respected about your book. So let's go into that. How can someone who may identify with a certain party or way of thinking be open to loving someone who isn't that way?
This was a really important part of the journey for me around all of this, that I realized there's this whole screen addiction thing and this form of closure we're experiencing internally to our own minds, where we're closing such that it's more difficult to experience discomfort and things like that. But to your point, there's this whole second realm of closure that's more external, that I think we're also all experiencing in a new way, which I call it political polarization. There's a lot of different labels for it. But the basic idea is that you go back 10 or 20 years, and at least for me, if I think about people who had a different political perspective, these were people who just had a different way of seeing the world.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, I started to notice in myself and in just about everyone around me, anytime somebody would hold a different view about politics or a different view about any of these controversial issues, now they were deluded, they were insane, they were morons, right? They were the enemy. So what I decided to do as part of this project is I wanted to see, like, what would happen if I just completely immersed myself in people who had radically different views on the world. And so, just context here, I live in Boulder, Colorado, which is a very liberal enclave. And I'm one of those people who thinks gun control is a good thing. I'm terrified of guns. I don't like guns. I don't like touching them. I'm, just afraid of the whole thing. So I ended up going to a concealed carry training hosted by the National Rifle Association in rural Colorado. And it was one of the most incredible spiritual mindfulness experiences in my whole life. Because, it's one thing to go to this beautiful, secluded mountain retreat center and meditate, but it's another thing to experience opening and mindfulness when you're just confronted by your political adversaries in such a deep way. And of course, I'm the only guy there who's from Boulder. And so, all sorts of crazy things happen there, which we can get into. But I think the main thing that happened for me is I left that experience realizing that these people were just like me in so many ways, and that there really was no enemy. And for me, that was kind of this like mind shattering experience. Like I could never see politics in the same way because I just would have these experiences, over lunch with folks where their humanity was so clear to me.
Yeah.
And, our shared projects and pursuits and views were so clear, in spite of the fact that, yeah, we totally disagree about guns and Trump and various other things. But yeah, I'm curious. It sounds like you've been playing around with this as well. How does it show up for you?
Yeah, not to make it about me for too long, but I probably am close to the opposite of you in the way I think about this, which is why I think it's good to talk about this stuff together.
Yeah.
So I went to a school where I believe I was forced to believe certain things and brainwashed in many ways. I had no way of thinking for myself. I was told, if you don't agree with these viewpoints, you are a bad person, you're bigoted, you're all these things, which I think is bad on either side. Right? You go to Christian school, same thing.
For sure.
Right? So I went out of it. I went out of college and high school. That whoever I met that was on the other side was immediately a vile, disgusting person that wasn't worthy of their humanity. Yeah. And that, I think one of the most damaging parts of the ego is that of separation, is separating yourself from another human because of an ideology, right? So I'd hate someone just because they had one opinion. And that cost me so much hate and lack of love in the world. And the minute that I kind of awakened and I was like, whoa, I'm literally hating people just off one thought in their head. And the amount of love that was taking out of me, I realized how much pain that was causing me and our collective humanity. So I like you, when my heart opened, I was like, I just can't do this anymore. I cannot judge someone or reduce someone's humanity to a single ideology, a viewpoint. That's, I think, what is happening now on both sides. It's like, you believe this thing, and therefore that you are the whole thing. Whatever ideology that's tied to, you are this whole thing. And it's brutal, and it really hurts my heart that almost every single American citizen is in that space, which is complete disconnection from other people. So I think we should to maybe motivate people who are in that space to open. What has been your perceived advantage of the life you're living now, not so judgmental of other people's opinions, while holding your own opinions to your heart, versus you when you were super closed off and judgmental? How does that feel as a human being right now, that difference?
Yeah. Well, I liked your point. It really resonated for me that when I really closed down around politics, I'm the one who loses.
Yeah.
I'm the one who then opens the newspaper every day and feels outrage. I'm the one who goes to a family reunion and feels stressed out and like I can't talk to certain people, or I want to talk to certain people and show that I'm right.
Yeah.
All of that is actually really bad for me too. It's bad for the collective, but I'm bathing myself in this cocktail of cortisol and stress hormones as a result of this. So there's that piece. And then there's the piece, which I actually think is really important, that I talk about in the book, these two ways of engaging in conversation. One is strategic. This is the mode that we usually engage in political conversation with. It's this idea that the goal is essentially to win in a conversation. That if you and I, Lucas, believe something different, then I'm going to see if I can counter your arguments and offer a better case and somehow convince you that my view is the right view, that your view is the wrong view. It's like we're playing a game. And there's a place for that in politics, I think. We need that. We need debates. I'm not saying like we never need that. But it feels like right now, that's all we have. We only have this strategic dimension of speech. The opposite of that, the more open technique for engaging in conversation, is something where the intent isn't so much to win, but to understand, to actually listen. And I think there's something just so beautiful about that when I'm able to do this. And this is another one of these practices where I stumble sometimes and I'm not able to do it.
Same here.
But when I'm able to do it, when I'm able to do it though, like at this NRA training, it was so interesting, just like really understanding why everyone at this training had a different view. And what I found, which was really interesting to me, unexpected, is that I realized at the end of this, our disagreement around guns had nothing to do with guns and everything to do with having different views about human nature. So I start from the assumption that, most people are pretty good. It's a pretty safe world. They're really, there are a few times in life where you encounter some sort of violence, but for the most part, people are good, things are good. They started from a different assumption, which was something more like, hey, we live in a world filled with predators, was the way our instructor put it. And you're always just one Walmart trip away from potentially getting shot, and nobody else is going to protect you. You've got to protect yourself. And so I thought to myself, if I started from that same premise around human nature, would I want to buy a gun and carry it with me everywhere I went? Yes, 100%. So that was like so interesting to me, just to see that the disagreement wasn't about guns at all. It was just about the way we view the world. And who's right? I don't know. I'm not sure. But, it leads to just like way more interesting conversation, I think.
Yeah, it's everything. I think with that point you made of, so my family is one that is very intellectual and, all very well educated, and most dinners just, we used to be just debate and this egoist, sounds to me, it's an ego contest. It's not like there's no heart to heart, it's ego to ego. It's like who is the more dominant, intelligent person here. It's like who wins, whose argument is the most correct. And I got to a point where it was basically like I couldn't do anymore. I was like, I either never see my family because it's like everyone's yelling at me because I'm the one who thinks differently. Yeah. And it was like, I can't let something like this affect my people I love the most, which it is for most people. So I learned this the hard way and the right way, but it's brutal because most people just go back home to their families and they're stuck there, just being like, it's stuck in this place of I can't talk to them. They hate me and all this stuff. And so I really commend the fact that you're speaking about this and opening yourself up to this stuff, because one thing, either in this space, it's like either people are like, fuck politics, doesn't matter, it's an illusion, right? Or there are people who are just over into it. So I really respect and appreciate your nuanced understanding that this is part of life. Yeah. Right. We're going to believe in these things. And we have to get to a place where they don't make us absolutely hate each other.
Absolutely. Well, and can I share one story that I actually heard this after writing the book? So it's not something I wrote about in the book, but
go for it.
I just felt like it was such a profound example of the change that's possible. So Adam Grant writes about this guy in his book, Think Again, named Daryl Davis, who was a Black country music piano player. And he was at a gig in the 1980s. And a white guy came up to him after the gig and was like, hey, that was really good. I didn't know your people could play that well. And this guy's like, whoa, that's a little weird. But he's like, yeah, there's a long line of really good Black piano players. And the white guy then reveals, this is the first time I've ever talked to a Black person. And this guy, Daryl Davis, is like, whoa, that's crazy. Why? The white guy says, well, because I'm in the Ku Klux Klan. And this guy, Daryl, basically just starts laughing. He can't believe it. But then the white guy pulls out his membership card. Yeah, he was in the Ku Klux Klan. So at that moment, Daryl could have easily just walked away and nobody would blame him for doing it. He's talking to a Klansman. But instead, he ends up having a drink with this guy. And the white guy says, hey, I'd love to see you again when you play in town. Here's my phone number. So Daryl calls him the next time he comes into town. The two become good friends. And the white guy eventually ends up leaving the Ku Klux Klan. And then this guy, Daryl, ends up having all sorts of conversations with Klans members, and around 200 people leave the Ku Klux Klan as a result of these conversations. And the reason I think this story is so incredible is it shows that if we want to change the world and change the point of view of someone else, the pathway to that isn't by doing that sort of strategic style of speech where we're trying to show that they're wrong, they're a racist, they're a bigot, right? It's actually trying to understand them. And that was Daryl's basic method. And it's interesting to see how much he was able to change the world, and contrast that to another style where, somebody, just starts berating these guys for believing the wrong thing or whatever. Their views wouldn't change at all. If anything, their views would have gotten more extreme.
Yep. I think love understands, hate condemns, right? That's what I always try and keep in the back of my head. In myself, even judging people, right? I have a very judgmental mind. That's one of my shadows. Because I'm very perceptive of people. I can read people very easily. And we all have our shit, and I end up judging it super intensely. But what I tell myself, and similar to what you're saying, is that I'm not doing a good job as a thinker or observer, right? I have to understand why they're that way, right? So if you meet someone who is, brash and arrogant, and you just see that, oh, they're arrogant, right? Yeah. But if you look deeper, ask them questions, oh, they got no attention as a kid, they got beat up. There's always a reason why we have these things. So it's the most loving thing to do, is have someone with a certain opinion we don't agree with and be like, why the fuck do they think this way? Even if we think it's irrational, why? And in that way, we connect to them. And then ask them, and we get inquisitive. It's really the only way to be. But I think it's also, I don't know if you thought about this too, I want to move into the somatic piece right?
Yeah.
Because it's like for me, when I was super reactive to people whose opinions was different to mine, it was a nervous system issue that when I felt triggered, I felt I couldn't deal with it, right? Like
Yeah.
I thought I saw them as wrong and bigoted, and then this trigger came up, and then I ended up spilling that on them. So for you, is it a kind of, have you thought about that way of being? Like, is it how to manage the somatic trigger of
Yeah.
feeling hatred or feeling angry at someone? Now I still feel it sometimes, of
Mhm.
course, but I treat it as mine. It's like,
Yeah.
this is my shit. This is my poison. Nothing to do with them.
Totally.
I think it's important piece we should talk about too, is like how to manage that trigger of wanting to judge, wanting to condemn, and not reacting to it. Like, I'm sure when you were in
Yeah.
the NRA room, part of you was like, well, holy fuck, these people, like, holy shit. And you had to
Yes.
bypass that to experience
Yeah.
love.
Well, like you, I was trained to have a very short trigger. I spent 5 years getting my PhD in political philosophy, and that was like a samurai training in how to be incredibly reactive and defensive. We were, in fact, told if you don't defend your ideas, you're not doing this right. The idea of like conceding a point or saying, wow, that's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought about that. That was, in a way, defeat.
Yep.
So I was trained for years to have this samurai like attitude toward anybody who disagreed with me, and trained this skill of being able to pick apart other people's arguments with precision, and just, we call them demolition jobs, to be able to just like destroy someone's argument. And I took pride in that, and it felt good.
Mhm.
And there was that whole somatic experience you're talking about, where I would feel this kind of rage or anger in my system, and I would just let it rip, and then they would have that same anger in their system, and they'd let it rip back at me. And it was kind of this like weird game we were playing. And then at a certain point, I just totally burned out at the end of 5 years of that. I think my system was so overloaded, I just couldn't do it anymore. And I got really anxious and depressed, and my nervous system just couldn't handle that experience anymore. So I just wanted to bring that up. But then, to your point, how do we self regulate in those situations? I think it comes back to your original point about awareness being the key, that we're going to feel something when we're really triggered, or when we're around people who have this potential to trigger us. There's going to be a nervous system reaction. I think that's very difficult to get rid of. So the key moment is that moment where everything tightens up, or there's that sensation of anger rising, or the breath shortens, or whatever it is, to just like have that moment of recognition and pause. And it's almost like, surf that wave instead of letting that wave crash over you, kind of thing. Which, again, easier said than done, and not able to do it all the time. But to me, I think that's the real game. And so all of these other practices like yoga and meditation, things like that, are in a way training our ability to do that more skillfully in those moments. One of my first meditation teachers was a Zen monk who told me that his teacher told him, what you get from meditating is every decade or so, you get 1 second between that stimulus and response. You get an extra second.
Yes. Yes.
And you think like, oh, well, who cares about that extra second? But sometimes that extra second is a big deal, because
Huge deal.
that allows you to catch the wave. Yeah.
Yeah. I think one of the most important skills to have is to not be reflexive. It's like the amount of times I just kind of catch myself about to say something and I don't, has saved me a ton of issues in my life. And most people are just reflexive. They feel triggered and just like, ah. And now I have this like this pause, what you say. And I've never thought about it that way, which it's definitely something that comes with time, is probably the most useful skill. And when I head towards kind of one last topic, you had one concept in the book that I really liked, which I'd love for you to expand on, is the concept of happy land. So what is happy land, and how do we, what's its trap? So define it and then discuss what the problems of it.
Happy land is this illusion that I feel like we are very familiar with, but it's unconscious in a way. So think about, you go into a place like Instagram or wherever your favorite place is, where you see a lot of self-improvement influencer types. And there's this illusion that's being peddled, which is this idea that you can feel good all the time. If you just take the right supplements, if you just do the right workouts, if you just intermittently fast, or if you just do these things or follow these steps, you can feel this experience of bliss like radiating from your genitals to your head all day, every day. One spiritual teacher that I encountered at one point in my life called it the mildly orgasmic experience of life. She said, I experience every moment as a mild orgasm. And I thought to myself, wow, that sounds awesome. Like, I want that. The problem with Happy Land, I think, is that the range of human emotions includes a lot more than just orgasmic bliss. And I'm not like down on orgasmic bliss. I think orgasmic bliss is amazing. Like, we should experience that when we can. But life includes so many other states. I just had a friend, close family friend of ours, died about a week and a half ago, who was in her late 30s, and got the flu and died in 2 days, just suddenly. And if I approach that from the Happy Land perspective, the problem is like, oh, well, how do I get back from this bummer to feeling like orgasmic bliss all the time? So it kind of creates this pattern of spiritual bypassing that I think we're all familiar with, of like, I don't want to feel the bad stuff in life. I just want to feel good all the time. And there's this kind of cycle that I've experienced with Happy Land where, I keep thinking, if I do this, if I add this practice, if I add this supplement, I'm going to get there. And then I don't get there. And then I feel disappointed and I feel like I did something wrong and I blame myself. And then I redouble on my efforts and I try something new and try this. And then I don't get there. And I feel like, oh man, like, what am I doing wrong? And I guess the big realization I came to in this whole project was, I don't think we're doing anything wrong. I think life just includes a lot of different mind states. Some of them are really amazing and blissful and beautiful, and some of them are torturous and really hard. And so that's the basic idea, is that if we can name this thing, this illusion in the mind of Happy Land, we can navigate it more skillfully and just sort of be open to the reality that, this is Buddha's first noble truth, right? Life includes suffering. That's just part of the game.
Yeah, I ask because it's probably the thing I struggle with the most, especially now, is I've read the piles of books, I've done various mentorships. I mean, my job is literally interview people like yourself to figure out how to be always happy. And I got to a place where I'm almost there, and let me branch off that, but I can basically come back to that peace pretty fast.
Yeah.
Over anything. Like a little trigger, I come back fast. Like in tennis, you hit the net, you come back to presence, so you can be ready for the next point. And I thought about that from a place of pride. I was like, oh man, nothing can happen. But I realized I've kind of lost my humanity in the process. And it's sad. It really is. Because when someone was sad next to me, I'd immediately look at the humanity. I'd be like, oh, what's wrong? I'd help them. But now I go straight to like, what the fuck is wrong with them, right? Like, why are they sad? How can you be sad? And so I've fallen for this trap because I've actually reached it. I thought Happy Land was impossible. Like, oh, I can't be happy, because I was actually depressed as fuck for most of my life. I was truly miserable. I was in miserable land. So for me, I was like, oh, if I could be happy, and then I reached it, and now I'm in this other extreme. So I don't know if you because you have the philosophical intelligence and tools to kind of always be in that state. So have you sat with that, like, that in your mind, like? Am I at a place where I'm kind of bypassing shit, where I'm just always peaceful and always happy? Like, I still don't have an answer, because for me, it's like, if I can come back to happiness and peace, why do I have to feel these things? So I haven't fully answered it. I've still been sitting with it. So I'm curious where you stand with that kind of way of thinking.
Boy, that's such a great point and such a great inquiry. I think for me, there's almost like this balance. So I think about one of my favorite ideas from Aristotle was, he had this idea that virtue is the mean between too much of something and too little of something, excess and deficiency. And I think this is a place where we can get caught in that trap of deficiency, which you're describing, of like depressed land. Everything is horrible land. And that sucks. But there's this other trap of like, trying to cultivate this experience of bliss all day, every day, and almost like not experiencing, some of the things that are really happening for us or for other people. And I like the way Ram Dass talked about this. One of my favorite spiritual teachers. He said, don't forget your Buddha nature, but also don't forget your social security number. And what I think he meant by that is like, the goal, at least the way he described it, is see if you can live in both planes of consciousness at the same time. So rather than just like bypassing the miseries of the world and being like, oh, everything is amazing, when somebody close to you dies, like that's a very strange place to be. It's amazing that they died, right? Like it's almost like, to your point, inhuman.
Yeah.
So we don't want to go too far in that direction, but we also want to remember that there's like this bigger game happening. And so there's this interplay of the relative and the absolute that I think is happening all the time. And gosh, this is another one of these practices that I feel like it's such an imperfect practice. But I guess I try to remember that there's a balance I want to try to strike between these two. I want to experience what it's like to be human and have fear and anxiety and think I'm not enough, and really like land in that experience and be with it. But I also don't want to get stuck there.
Yep.
I want to remember there's like a bigger game happening and there's a bigger perspective happening where it doesn't really matter at all. Like, I'm going to die in, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 years, maybe tomorrow, who knows? And it's all going to be over for me, So like, I don't know. It's kind of playing with those multiple perspectives together.
Yeah, I think that's why I tend to do it, because I'm either stuck in it or I'm not in it at all.
Yeah.
That's my experience. Either I'm like fully stuck in the misery and being a victim, or I'm just not about it at all.
Yeah.
And I think what the middle ground I've discovered is, maybe you can validate this after I say this, is to allow yourself to be with a sensation without intellectualizing it and trying to figure it out in your head, right? So if I'm feeling morose about something, just let it be. Let the morose sit with you rather than getting in your head and intellectualizing it, being like, why did this happen? Why am I feeling this way? Is it because of this? Is it because of that? How can I escape it? How can I da-da-da-da? Then it's just not the experience. I kind of realized the middle ground for me is just like letting the sensations be while also living my life and not trying to change them.
Yeah.
So I don't know where you're at with that. Like, is that a reasonable solution to like just not make it a story? That's the right way I'm to phrase it. To let the emotions be and not make them a story.
I think that's
some kind of middle ground, I feel like.
That's totally it. And one of the coolest interviews I was able to do for this project was with Mingyur Rinpoche, the Dzogchen master. He did this 4-year wandering retreat where he just disappeared into the world and basically became homeless and meditated for 4 years. Like amazing, amazing guy. And this was basically his teaching. He called it acknowledge the wave, but stay with the ocean. So the wave being the anxiety, the anger, the FOMO, whatever it is, to be able to acknowledge that, but then come back to this bigger perspective. And I asked him, like, well, but how do you do that? And his prescription was exactly what you described. What he said was the key is to just use sensation as the gateway. So you feel anxiety. The key is, instead of getting caught in storyland, where it's like, oh, now we're feeding the mind and these anxious thoughts about what's going to happen if this doesn't happen and then this happens, blah, blah, blah. I'm going to end up living under a bridge. Instead of getting caught in all that, it's just like, what's the sensation? Can I follow that sensation? Can I become interested in that sensation? Can I allow that sensation to be as it is? And what I thought was so cool about his teaching is it's like the wave, that sensation, is already in the ocean. Like you can understand the big expansive mind by simply paying attention to that one wave. You don't have to be in this like wide open state necessarily. It can be a more directed form of awareness that's connected to sensation that gets you back to that open mind experience.
Yep. I agree. I'm going to ask you one last quick fire question.
Okay.
Completely off topic, but I just curious about your answer. Because you in your book, you describe the benefits you felt when you went in the psychedelic rabbit hole journey to heal yourself. But the question I have is, do you think someone needs psychedelics to heal?
No, I don't. And I also think I try to be so careful with psychedelics. And I know you're on the same journey with psychedelics, just like how I even talk about them. I don't advocate psychedelics in the recreational setting at all. I mean, I think like if people want to do it, great, that's their choice. But what I found really interesting was psychedelic assisted therapy, which I think is a really different kind of practice
Yeah.
where we're now coupling these compounds with a guide and a really intentional structure of support and integration and all of these different things. To me, that's the piece of psychedelics that I find interesting. And for myself, I had a lot of really crazy, amazing experiences of overcoming some pretty deep fears and things like that through that psychedelic assisted therapy approach. But to circle back to the original question, I don't think it's necessary at all. Like I think you would agree with me that you look at the great meditators and spiritual beings throughout all of history, like the Buddha wasn't taking LSD. The Buddha just meditated. Right? Jesus wasn't taking psilocybin, right? There are other routes to these states. And I think that is one of the traps of psychedelics these days is thinking like, oh, well, this is now the only way. You got to do ketamine, you got to do MDMA, and like, this is the only way to experience altered states of consciousness. And that's definitely not true. Yoga, breathing techniques, meditation. There's a million different ways we can experience altered states of consciousness. So I don't know. Is that a helpful answer? I'd be curious actually to hear your answer because I know just from social media that you have a healthy dose of skepticism around psychedelics.
Yeah, I think I love your answer, and I knew you'd answer it that way. That's why I wanted to get your perspective. Because I think for I'm not anti psychedelics, but I'm anti this belief in this self-help space that they're like this. I see them as a get healed quick scheme. That's the way I could label it, right? It's a get healed quick scheme. It's saying, go to this jungle, take ayahuasca, and everything's fine, right? And all your shit, all your trauma, all your shadows are gone. And my issue became the fact that that's part of that. That's why I think they have to be careful with psychedelics, is that they're not going to heal you fully. They're going to make you aware of something, like you said, and it can take you years of integration to actually do that thing. But beyond that, I did this Ram Dass quote. I should have written it down, but I can't. I'm going to butcher it. But I can say the concept of it was that when you frequently do psychedelics, it's so different to being human when you're in a psychedelic state, right? Like you are experiencing in a high dose, you're experiencing unconditional love, peace. You experience bliss, and to what I understand, you experience where we come from, where we go. In my experience, right? Taking DMT and all these things, and when you're always in that state, you come back to your human body. You're like, what the fuck is this shit? Why am I feeling fear? Why am I feeling separated? And then you shame yourself. You're like, why is this happening, right? And for me, I did the psychedelic route. I did about 2 years doing them a lot, and I learned a lot. But there was this constant like back and forth, this shame of my humanity. And then the past 2 years, I've been completely sober. I've advanced a lot more, just because there's no other option. There's no memory of bliss. There's just, this is what I have. This is my instrument. Thank you for the lessons I learned on psychedelics, but I want to do my best to cultivate that love and bliss inside myself to whatever I can be with. So that's why that's why I speak out. I think that there's this belief that they are the best way to do everything, and they help. They do, but there's also issues, and you don't need them. And in my experience, it's more advantageous to take the route of complete sobriety. In my experience, just to really master your internal state. So, but I appreciate you having that perspective because for me, it's either one or the other in this space. It's either someone saying they're amazing and they heal everything, or like they're demonic and you're going to hell if you have them. So I appreciate your take.
Yeah, can I add just one last thing on psychedelics?
Go for it. Yeah.
Well, I was at the MAPS Psychedelic Sciences Conference in Denver last year, and there were like 12,000 people. And it was really interesting because there really were two camps. There was one camp that was basically like, psychedelics are going to cure everything. People should take psychedelics all the time. Don't worry about having any support, blah, blah, blah. And then there was the more careful camp that I would put myself in. And one of the dangers I see in that more laissez-faire view of psychedelics is that for certain people, these compounds can have catastrophic consequences.
Yeah.
So I had a relative who took LSD 30 years ago at a rock concert. And he has had just crippling major depression ever since then. And it has basically destroyed his life. So I think that what I saw at that MAPS conference is that there was this tendency to kind of underplay the possibility of really bad trips, or people who have a predisposition towards schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, things like that. Like these trips really can trigger like deep mental illness. And granted, it's a small percentage of people, but I also just like to make that point. And that's part of why, if somebody's considering doing this, having somebody who's an expert to do a really careful screening to make sure it's even a good idea in the first place, I think is really important. Because gosh, I don't know about you, but I've seen a lot of people's lives destroyed by psychedelics, not enhanced at all, but just like really diminished.
I appreciate you saying that, but even for me, it's like, if I didn't have someone who can explain to me what I experienced, I would literally think I was schizophrenic. I think if people are taking these compounds, there's people who actually take them when their brain chemistry doesn't agree with it and they go insane. But there's people who take them, experience the other side of whatever this madness is in this life, and they're like, what the fuck was that shit? And they feel like then they don't know what to do and they go insane. So there's both sides too. But thank you for the nuance and thank you for coming on. And I really appreciate your book, and I really recommend to people to read it. Where can they get it, and where can people also find more of your work to learn more?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the book is available everywhere books are sold. My website is Nate Klemp, that's with a K.com. And I have a newsletter there that goes out every couple of weeks with tips and tools. And then on Instagram, at Nate Klemp. Even though I'm not big on screens, I do sometimes post stuff and, try to be on Instagram a little bit.
Yeah, we all have to, unfortunately. But thank you again, man. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Lucas. This has been such an enlivening, amazing conversation for me.
Same here. Thanks, man. I hope you enjoyed that video. If you want to watch more content, please click this video right here and don't forget to subscribe right here. Thank you.